So we continue our conversation, which we began last time about William Shakespeare. Of course, if we think about the proportion of time I give to Shakespeare and to everybody else, the course might seem a little bit disbalanced. But the thing is that during the 12 lectures, all the same, we wouldn't be able to speak about every author in detail. And Shakespeare is someone who deserves much greater attention than any individual author. And the aim of the course, among other things, is to give you an idea of what Shakespeare's texts are like, and probably later to encourage you to read them by yourselves. So some longer explanation is required than it is the case, for example, with some 19th century poets, whose texts are not that difficult to understand linguistically, and whose texts are rather transparent conceptually. It's not difficult to explain why Hamlet, why George Gordon Byron is writing about Childe Harold and what exactly he meant when he was doing it, or what he meant when he was writing about Don Juan, or for that matter, what he meant when he was writing his Hebrew melodies. Just some texts from the Old Testament or some plots from the Old Testament being rendered in contemporary English, Byron's contemporary English. So here explanations are of necessity not that long and not that complicated. Well, with Shakespeare, who definitely deserves the attention of the reader, there is great likelihood that without explanations, people would fail to understand him and would accept the general approach formulated by our national genius, Leo Tolstoy, who had been extremely skeptical about Shakespeare and who, in the later years of his career, wrote 2 articles, rather long, both of them, about his attitude to Shakespeare's dramatic works. And following the logic so often used by Tolstoy in other texts, what I don't understand and what I don't like does not have the right to exist. Or when people say they like something I don't like, they are either stupid or they are hypocrites. Tolstoy writes about Shakespeare as an author who is grossly overestimated, and in fact, there was nothing special about his plays. He speaks about Shakespeare's bombastic language, he speaks about his immorality, citing King Lear as an example, the 2 good daughters who say they love their father later turn out to be criminals, and the not so good daughter who is proclaimed to be a good daughter, who says to the father that she likes him and loves him no more and no less than it befits a daughter, she turns out to be an angel. And Tolstoy doesn't quite see the reason why the 2 nice, obedient daughters in the beginning of the text at least, later become termagants, and why Cordelia, who cannot be called, according to Tolstoy, a good daughter, turns out to be an angel. And these are the explanations offered by our national genius. And as for Shakespeare's language, he says that for many years he felt that there was something definitely wrong about Shakespeare's texts, but as he did not know English well enough, as he said, he believed that probably there was something wrong about his comprehension of Shakespeare's works. But then, proudly says Tolstoy, he learned English by reading the Bible in the parallel manner in English and in Russian. He learned the English language like this, and the Bible, by the way, contains from 8,000 to 9,000 words, while Shakespeare is at least to 20,000. So Tolstoy says, I've learned the English language, now I'm reading Shakespeare, and I'm not enjoying his language, simply because he writes in a bombastic style, and everything could have been said much more succinctly and clearly. So he fails to understand the appropriate tradition if we follow his logic, Tredyakovsky and Lomonosov should not be read either, simply because they use the words not familiar to the 19th or 20th century writer. But Tolstoy doesn't mind Tredyakovsky or Sumarokov, but he says, as I don't understand his language, it means his language is bad. I have my knowledge of English connected with 9,000 words, so a person who is using 20,000 words uses the language wrongly. That's quite comical and, in a sense, absurd. But if we don't receive appropriate explanations, we would, in fact, secretly be prepared to say that, after all, Tolstoy was right. We fail to understand Shakespeare, both conceptually and linguistically. That's why he's not a good writer. And those who say that he is a good writer are either hypocrites following the tradition, or simply stupid people who fail to understand the aesthetic inadequacies of the text. To avoid this and to prevent the readers from either accepting Shakespeare's greatness without understanding what this greatness consists in, or secretly defying Shakespeare because they agree with Tolstoy, for this reason, I am ready to produce longer explanations as for Shakespeare's language and the content of his texts, simply because, in my opinion, he actually deserves it, and people who fail to understand the conceptual and the linguistic side of his writings deprive themselves of a lot of pleasure, aesthetic pleasure and intellectual pleasure. With Byron or with Coleridge or with Shelley or with Keats, the problems of this kind are non-existent. That's why in this rather limited course of lectures, I still prefer to speak in detail about Shakespeare to make sure that the readers who feel like continuing to get acquainted with Shakespeare's texts will have enough material and explanation to understand what they are reading. So, Shakespeare, all in all, wrote 154 sonnets, the least significant contribution, in his own opinion. There were 37 plays, 36 of them were included in the so-called First Folio, the collection of Shakespeare's texts published in 1623, 7 years after his death. The canon, in its modern understanding, includes 37 plays, 36 included in the First Folio, plus Pericles, which wasn't published in the First Folio, but probably the problem of copyright was not yet solved by the publishers. But later it was included in all Shakespeare's collections, and there is little doubt that the text actually belongs to Shakespeare. There were other texts published during Shakespeare's lifetime with the indication of his name on the title page, but later they were considered spurious and they were believed to be non-Shakespearean simply because they were not included in the First Folio, and the textual history is such that there is a feeling that somebody else wrote the texts, but the publishers used Shakespeare's name simply because they wanted to make profit, mentioning the name of a famous author on the title page. So now, periodically, some plays like Edward III or Sir John Oldcastle are introduced in the Shakespearean canon. There are debates among the scholars, and it's clear why people are ready to introduce some other texts, simply because if we are left with the 37 plays originally included in the canon, we feel that during the last 300 years at least, nothing is happening about Shakespeare. And we want something to happen. So let's discover the 38th play, describe it, discuss it, fight with our opponents, and there would be a feeling that in Shakespeareology, after all, a lot of things are happening, even though the canon had been established almost 400 years ago. So it's no wonder that periodically some texts appear I myself doubt the fact that Shakespeare had been the author of those problematic plays, but here it would take us too long to discuss this question, and I would like to turn to the texts which are undoubtedly his and which are masterpieces in their own right. So there is no reason for us to doubt that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet or Macbeth or Titus Andronicus or Venus and Adonis or Rape of Lucrece. And even if we're left with that collection of texts, we have quite enough material to study. And some obvious masterpieces, of course, are included in this collection. So 37 plays, 154 sonnets, 2 long narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece, written when Shakespeare was 29 and 30 respectively, or rather published in those times. And these 2 plays contain the clear dedication to the Earl of Southampton, which suggests that interpretations, for example, of the sonnets, which are connected with the name of that aristocrat, probably are more convincing than the attempts to move them chronologically a bit later and to say that Shakespeare began to write them not in 1590 but later, and that would imply the change of the addressee. The fact that the 2 poems are dedicated to the Earl of Southampton, a lot of biographical information contained in the sonnets and obviously related to some biographical situations in the life of the young Earl, all this suggests that he was the one known benefactor of Shakespeare and probably the person whom those 154 sonnets were dedicated to. So the sonnets, the narrative poems, 37 plays, the Phoenix and the Turtle, with which we began our acquaintance with Shakespeare, and some minor texts, very few of them, which are not included in that list I have cited previously. So Shakespeare must have begun writing at the end of 1580s, when he was not yet 25 years old, which explains why in some 10 years he would become an author of considerable repute, and this would cross out the possibility of him being the so-called late beginner. He began writing for various London theatres, of which by the middle of 1590s there would be some 7 different theatrical companies. And the traditional genres in which the authors were working were comedy, tragedy, and the chronicles. In some cases, it's rather difficult to say definitely what category of plays a certain text belongs to, because Measure for Measure, for example, written at the turn of the century, is not at all funny or amusing, but it's called a comedy. And then there would be attempts among Shakespeareologists to explain that among the comedies, there might be comedies in the proper sense of the word, and there might be darker comedies, which are not exactly comedies, which shows not really the inadequacy of the classification. The classification itself is clear. It shows Shakespeare's attempts to overcome the traditional restrictions of a genre and to create something that the public would not expect from a comedy or from a tragedy, simply because in this way he would ensure the diversity of his works and would make sure that the public would treat his texts with additional attention, because certain turns of the plot would contradict the traditional idea of what a tragedy or a comedy should be like. And in this case, Shakespeare's texts would cause additional interest of the reader. So he began with comedies, tragedies, and with the chronicles, and in this way he continued. during the whole of his career, he would be writing plays belonging to different genres, and understanding this helps to defy yet another traditional point about Shakespeare, according to which he began by writing comedies. Until the end of Elizabeth's life, he was writing mainly comedies and the chronicles, history plays. And then his mood changed because closer to the end of Elizabeth's reign, everybody was a bit anxious as to what would happen after Elizabeth's death. And he began writing tragedies. And when Elizabeth died and James became king, Shakespeare continued writing tragedies because probably he was in a bad mood still, and he had not noticed that James had become king of England. And then he would write the so-called romantic plays. That's the idea upon which certain classifications are based, which is quite absurd, of course. And if we take into account the fact that during all those periods, in fact, all three genres were represented in Shakespeare's texts, we will see that if we need a classification, it should be based on some other criteria. And in fact, the criteria is very simple. The kind of audience he was addressing. He began with rather primitive comedies because at that time he was producing plays for some rather insignificant theaters. And with those comedies or the early history plays, he was simply learning how to write. Then, when he became the member of the Company of Lord Chamberlain, the cousin of Queen Elizabeth, he was a benefactor, a protector, a patron of some group of actors. It's very likely that among Shakespeare's spectators, there appeared Queen Elizabeth herself. And in this situation, the plays become more sophisticated. And periodically we see some young ladies, intellectual, a bit tired of life, being unable to find a suitable husband. That would be the character we find in the cast of the players. And quite obviously, it seems to be addressed to Queen Elizabeth herself. And the plays are not too provocative, they're not too philosophical, but they are quite intellectual all the same. And they were aimed at flattering Elizabeth as one of the potential members of the audience. Then came the moment of Elizabeth's death, and King James I became the patron of that particular troupe of actors. James was no mean judge as far as drama was concerned. He was a very educated man. He loved theater. And 2 months after he became king, he produced a license for this group of actors where Shakespeare was working, and his name is mentioned in the royal license. James was calling them the king's men, his own men, and the company would have the preferential treatment, and Shakespeare would be officially the playwright addressing the king. Here again, the character of the plays changes because the main addressee was no longer an unmarried woman in a rather advanced age who had to be flatteringly shown both as attractive and highly intellectual and in the prime of her life. James became the target audience, and here Shakespeare, to please the monarch, decided to write plays somehow connected with the writings of James himself. And so Macbeth would be written to somehow answer James' literary efforts when he was writing about Scottish history. measure for measure would be written, because somehow it would be illustrating James' idea of what political power generally was like. King Lear was also written, and Othello, illustrating and being the answers to some other early writings of King James. And then some artistically and aesthetically problematic plays like Cymbeline or The Winter Tale were written, and they were probably addressed to King James's eldest son, Prince Henry, who would die at the age of 18. Shakespeare still was connected with the Catholic resistance in the country, and in all his plays, dedicated either to Elizabeth or addressed to James, there would always be a plea for toleration and the idea that if there are rival groups in a society, both groups have the right to be heard, and that the nature of power was such that the king, an administrator, should approach his subjects on equal terms. He should not make preferences. But both with Elizabeth and with James, those hopes were absolutely in vain. And after the Gunpowder Plot, which took place in 1605, and the victims of it, sometimes these were the real participants, sometimes these were people implicated by the authorities who in fact had got nothing to do with the Gunpowder Plot itself, like Henry Garnet, the then head of the Jesuit mission in England. Those people were cruelly executed. James became nearly hysterical, and he was ready to continue the suppression of Catholics, which had been initiated by Elizabeth and which later, in the beginning of his reign, was stopped by James. He continued yet again, and the representatives of the circles with whom Shakespeare was connected felt desperately pessimistic and depressed. And so they found yet another person with whom some hopes for religious toleration could be connected, the eldest son of James. He was not an intellectual like his father. He was rather a sportsman without much intellectual aspiration, but still Prince Henry was a good boy in the opinion of so many people who could be instructed in chivalrous behavior and on a different, less sophisticated level, could be invited still to be tolerant and to be ready to listen to both sides in any conflict. And so the intellectual qualities of the target audience were changed from the sophistication of Elizabeth and King James I, and Shakespeare was addressing a young gentleman with no particular intellectual aspirations. That's why the play change yet again. They become easier to understand. They become more romantic. They describe the heroic situation in the world history or some imaginary heroic situation, something that would be close to the heart of that sportive and intellectually not terribly bright young prince. And then in 1612, James lost his son, Henry died, and this was the last hope for the time being for the Catholics connected with religious toleration. And next year after Henry's death, in 1613, Shakespeare retires. Before his retirement, he buys this famous house in Blackfriars, where the fatal Vespers would take place in 1625, and where, before Shakespeare, relatives of Edmund Campion and Robert Parsons and Robert Southwell would be living. And then for 3 years of the last 3 years of his life, Shakespeare spends in Stratford, and there he dies on the 23rd of April, presumably his birthday. So he was born on the 23rd of April, 1564, and he died on the 23rd of April, 1616. So that's briefly Shakespeare's biography. 7 years after that, his famous first folio would be published by his fellow actors John Hemmings and Henry Condell. And then in the 17th century, the Civil War would take place, during which no theatrical activity was allowed in the country, during Cromwell's reign especially. And then in 1660s, after the Restoration, the old plays were performed yet again, but already the tastes of the public and the playwrights changed. Shakespeare's texts were considered to be rude, rough, to contain squalid lower-class characters, and the texts were purified. They were shortened and cleansed, even by Shakespeare's champions like David Harrod and Samuel Johnson. And only in the middle of the 18th century was Shakespeare yet again recognized as national genius #1. His plays were performed in full, and the returning of Shakespeare in his original form to the theater and to his spectators began. And now we have Shakespeare, whose plays are performed everywhere, and texts are translated, and movies are made, but it was a rather long and tortuous way. And if we fail to understand what his texts are about, we may secretly join Leo Tolstoy in thinking that, after all, everything was rather primitive. In fact, it wasn't. So we have several examples from Shakespeare's texts to study. First comes Venus and Adonis, dedicated to the Earl of Southampton. It was published in 1593 and probably written a year earlier. And the reason why Shakespeare suddenly interrupted his career of a playwright and began to produce lyrical narrative poems was that the theaters in London at that time were closed for more than a year because the epidemics of plague. We now have a similar situation. So in this situation, when Shakespeare didn't earn any money to speak of, it was natural that some of his plays were published. Theaters tried not to do it ever until the plays they were performing became really old, because if you publish something and then all the remaining London theaters begin to play it together with you, the revenues go down dramatically. But some of Shakespeare's plays were published during this particular period, sometimes without the indication of his authorship, simply because the theatrical company needed the money to live. And the plays were published, and yet another text, not a dramatic one, was produced, simply because Shakespeare probably hoped that he would be rewarded for it by the dedicatee, the person whom the poem was dedicated to. Venus and Adonis is a rather playful text. It describes the attempts of the goddess Venus to get the attention of the young, beautiful, not even handsome, beautiful gentleman Adonis. And Venus is a voluptuous, active woman who is trying to get the favors of a boy who is barely 18 and who doesn't want any sexual intercourse with her. And she practically rapes the boy. Then the boy goes hunting, then he is killed by the boar, and then Venus is lamenting the whole situation, saying that if Adonis didn't love her, then she is ready to curse love generally. And she says that if love continues existing in the world, it will not be a pure feeling free of any care. In fact, now it will be a traumatic experience for everybody. Why was the text so hugely popular? Is that, first of all, it contains some kind of erotic component. The main character was behaving in an ungently womanly fashion, so to speak. And it had a graver implication. Queen Elizabeth, not exactly like Venus, of course, but he demanded the love of people, and when she did not receive it, she was ready to go to extraordinary lengths in demonstrating her dissatisfaction. So there would be a very specific interweaving of an old plot and the main characters being represented in a playful manner, and some graver connections with the contemporary situation when young people were chased by the royal power and by the queen, and she would insist on them being faithful to her, not in the physical sense, of course, but in the moral and in the emotional, in the religious, in the ideological manner. So for us to have a look at the text, for example, the beginning of the narrative poem, when Venus addresses Adonis, hoping that he would answer her invitations. Thrice fairer than myself, thus she began, the field's chief flower, sweet above compare, stained to all nymphs, more lovely than a man, more white and red than doves or roses are. Nature that made thee, with herself at strife, says that the world has ending with thy life. Vouchsafe thou wonder to allay thy steed, and rein his proud head to the saddle bow. If thou wilt deign his flavor, for thy mead, 1,000 honey secrets shalt thou know. Here come and sit, where never serpent hisses, and being said, I'll smother thee with kisses. So very clear invitation. And then when Adonis somehow fails to react appropriately, she, the fourth stanza, she seizes on his sweating palm the precedent of peace and livelihood, and trembling in her passion, calls it balm, earth's sovereign self to do a goddess good. Being so enraged, desire does lend her force, courageously to pluck him from his course. Strong woman. Over one arm the lusty courser's rein, under her other was the tender boy, who blushed and pouted in a dull disdain, with leaden appetite, unapt to toy. She reddened hot as coals of glowing fire, he red for shame, but frosty in desire. And then she asks him to answer her pleas, but he refuses. She says she had been so popular with men, why doesn't he react? I have been wooed, as I entreat thee now, even by the stern and direful god of war, whose sinew neck in battle ne'er did bow, who conquers where he comes in every jar. Yet has he been my captive and my slave, and begged for that which thou unasked shalt have. So why does he refuse? She has been so popular and so on. And then when he dies, the goddess, the queen, comes to her senses and says that in that situation she is ready to curse love. Since thou art dead, lo here I prophesy, sorrow and love hereafter shall attend. It shall be waited on with jealousy, find sweet beginning, but unsavory end. Ne'er settled equally, but how low, that all love's pleasure shall not match his woe. It shall be fickle, false, and full of fraud, bud and be blasted in a breathing while, the bottom poison, and the top o'erstrawed with sweets that shall the truest sight beguile. The strongest body shall it make most weak, strike the wise dumb, and teach the fool to speak. So that's a very elaborate text, playful mainly, although with some political implications. And the next poem, which would be published next year, 1594, is much more serious because it is connected with the rape of Lucrece, the noble woman of Rome, by the king, by the emperor, or Tsar, whoever he was, Tarquinius. And that would be already quite serious compared to the previous text, because it again alluded to the contemporary situation in England, where the country, the old church, they were defiled by the aggressive King Henry, ready to commit sacrilege because of his desires. An interesting text, also quite ornate, quite difficult to read, but those who have time and are ready to spend some time and some effort on deciphering a rather complicated text, I'm sure would enjoy reading both Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. The plays which were written by Shakespeare in 1590s contained, as I've said, history plays, or the chronicles, the way we call them in Russian, and some tragedies, like Romeo and Juliet, and a comedy, The Merchant of Venice, which, together with the play Measure for Measure, may be attributed to the category of those rather problematic comedies, which were in fact not comedies at all, but darker comedies. Richard II is a very interesting play by Shakespeare. It's an early play. We can't say it is as brilliant artistically as Hamlet, for example, but it's an interesting text because with it, a very tragic piece in the history, episode in the history of England, and potentially very dangerous episode in the history of Shakespeare's lifetime and in the functioning of his company. In this play, all these things, or rather, the play is connected with these tragic events, both in the history of the country and potentially tragic events which took place in Shakespeare's life. So Richard II was written in 1590s, in the first part of 1590s. Then the play was forgotten, it became old, and it was not played by Shakespeare's company any longer. Richard II is the King of England who became king after the death of his grandfather Edward III during the 100 Years' War in 1377, who ruled for 22 years and who then was deposed, nizložen, by his cousin Henry IV. We spoke about Richard II in connection with Wycliffe, in connection with the Lollards, or rather we spoke about the transition of power to Henry IV, who in fact, usurped the throne, and who had to take a much more lenient and comforting attitude towards the church than his two predecessors, Richard II and Edward III. And it was during Henry IV's reign that the constitutions of Oxford were adopted and so on. So this play describes the inadequacy of Richard II as a king, and it raises a very important question, whether the king is given to people by God forever, each particular king, or whether, in case of the king's incapacity, he may be deposed. And the answer Shakespeare gives is that the king may be deposed if his subjects are not satisfied. And after the play had been produced, and then it had not been produced, in the year 1601, when the play was about 10 years old, Shakespeare's company suddenly were asked to produce the play just the day before the Essex Rebellion. A young aristocrat who had been a favorite of Elizabeth, but then lost the Queen's favor, wanted to attack the royal palace, probably to arrest the ministers, probably even to arrest the Queen herself. The name was the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, and the Earl of Southampton, Shakespeare's known patron, was among the closest friends of the Earl of Essex. And so Shakespeare's company were asked by the friends of the Earl, just the day before the rebellion of the Earl, to produce Richard II, probably to inspire the people of London in the hope that they would support the Earl of Essex in his rebellion. And the play contained the so-called Deposition Scene, the scene when Richard II gives the crown to his more able cousin, Henry IV. And as Elizabeth and her senses were very sensitive to such situations when the ruler could lose his power, Elizabeth had this experience with Mary Stuart, and she was afraid that, for instance, if English people supported Mary, she would have to give the crown to Mary, and she would be acting in the capacity of Richard II. Because of these possible associations, Elizabeth never allowed plays of this kind to be performed. And though Shakespeare's play Richard II originally contained this deposition scene, when it was performed in London by Shakespeare's company, it was always played without this scene. So the situation when one king gives his crown to another, to a more able ruler, it was not shown during the performances of the play. But the friends of the Earl of Essex knew that the play had this deposition scene in it, and they asked Shakespeare's company to perform the play in full with the deposition scene just the day before the Essex Rebellion. The whole thing ended in disaster because next day, instead of thousands of supporters, Essex was supported by just a couple of hundred people. They were arrested, he was arrested, and then Shakespeare's play and the fact that it was performed just the day before the rebellion was used as a very strong argument against Essex. And Elizabeth is reported to have been strolling around her private chamber and saying, "So I am Richard II, he is Henry IV, how interesting." And although the Earl tried to say that he just wanted to rid Elizabeth of her inadequate ministers, the Queen never quite believed him, just because of this play. The actors were asked to explain themselves, to explain why they were performing this play at all, but because they had a powerful patron, Lord Chamberlain, somehow neither the players finally were punished nor Shakespeare. But the rumors were that the remaining months of Elizabeth's life, they preferred to make themselves scarce and to perform mainly out of London. So the episode was difficult, and probably it was never forgotten by the Queen. The deposition scene itself is not that brilliant. That's why I introduce an example from a play written during the first 10 years of Shakespeare's life to show his capacity as a writer. The king, it's Act 5 already, had been deposed, and now he is speaking to his wife, who says that he should have displayed much greater courage, and he says to his wife, to the queen, that they have to part, and he hoped that she would have nice reminiscences of him, but as a ruler and as a man, as a personality, he is finished, and he says that he can do nothing, although his wife insists that certain things should be done. This way the king will come. This is the way to Julius Caesar's ill-erected tower, to whose flint bosom my condemned lord is doomed a prisoner by proud Bolingbroke, meaning the future King Henry IV. Here let us rest, if this rebellious earth have any resting for her true king's queen. But soft, but see, or rather do not see, my fair rose wither. Yet look up, behold, that you in pity may dissolve to dew, and wash him fresh again with true love tears. Ah, thou the model where old Troy did stand, thou map of honor, thou King Richard's tomb, and not King Richard, thou most duteous in. Why should hard-favored grief be lodged in thee, when triumph has become an alehouse guest? Join not with grief, fair woman, do not so, to make my end too sudden. Learn, good soul, to think our former state a happy dream, from which await the truth of what we are, shows us but this. I am sworn brother sweet to grim necessity, and he and I will keep a league till death. Hie thee to France, and cloister thee in some religious house. Our holy lives must win a new world's crown, which our profane hours here have stricken down. What is my Richard both in shape and mind transformed and weakened? Has Bolingbroke deposed thine intellect? Has he been in thy heart? The lion dying thrushes forth his paw. The lion dying thrusts forth his paw and wounds the earth, if nothing else, with rage to be overpowered. And wilt thou, pupil-like, take thy correction mildly, kiss the rod, and fawn on rage with base humility, which art a lion and a king of beasts? A king of beasts indeed. If aught but beasts, I had been still a happy king of men. Good sometime queen, prepare thee hence for France. Think I am dead, and that even here thou takest, as from my deathbed, thy last living leave. In winter's tedious nights, sit by the fire with good old folks, and let them tell thee tales of woeful ages long ago bettered. And ere thou bid good night to quit thy griefs, tell thou the lamentable tale of me, and send the hearers weeping to their beds. For why the senseless brands will sympathize, the heavy accent of thy moving tongue, and in compassion weep the fire out. And some will mourn in ashes, some coal black, for the deposing of a rightful king. A dramatic situation, quite relevant to Elizabeth's audiences, the spectators, and written in a highly rhetorical and at the same time quite original man. Now let's have a look at The Merchant of Venice. We have two speeches by Shylock, and the third one, a celebrated piece produced by Portia. Again, it could be connected with the political situation in the country, with a particular episode when the royal physician, a doctor, was accused of trying to poison the queen. He was a Portuguese Jew, and there were some rampant anti-Semitic propaganda texts, both plays and prosaic journalistic pieces, written against the Jews and against this particular doctor. And it was natural that to attract the attention of the audience, people should write something that would be clear to the spectators. The criminal Jew opposed to Christians and trying to poison them, to spoil their lives, etc. And Shakespeare apparently joins those people, and he creates the figure, the character of Shylock, a usurer, ростовщик, a Jew. But the interesting thing about the play is that during the first 4 acts, Shylock behaves very nobly, and he insists on his right to be different. He says that the Christians use his money, his services, and at the same time they detest him. And he insists on his right to live, not like them, of course, but to be a respected member of society to whose well-being he contributes. And Shakespeare, instead of creating a kind of buffoon in the first scenes of the play, in the first acts, creates a very powerful figure of a person who insists on his human rights, so to speak, on his right to follow the rituals of his religion. And on the whole, in the play, he seems even more attractive than his Christian antagonists. But then in Act 4, Shakespeare remembers probably about the necessity to begin to play to the gallery to satisfy the mob, the populace, the more primitive spectators, and finally he does manage to turn Shylock into a kind of buffoon. Shylock, in the beginning of the play, agrees to lend money to a Christian, a certain merchant, Antonio. That's why the play is called The Merchant of Venice. And Antonio behaves disrespectfully to Shylock, and he says that he will take Shylock's money, but he will not respect him. And Shylock says that, okay, I'll give you the money, but if you don't return the money at the right moment, I will cut from your body a piece of flesh in weight equal to the weight of money that I am giving you. Antonio agrees to this and he signs the bond, and then, predictably, his ships carrying goods, which he planned to sell and to give the money to Shylock, those ships do not come to Venice in time, and so Shylock goes to the court and he demands his pound of flesh. And then Portia, a woman who is wooed by Antonio's friend Bassanio. Antonio took the money from Shylock to give the money to his friend Bassanio, who would then become a suitor to Portia, a rich woman, lonely, sophisticated, and so on, very much resembling Queen Elizabeth. So Bassanio needs the money to suggest himself as a husband to Portia. Antonio didn't need the money himself. He decided to support his friend in this rather questionable enterprise. And Bassanio, a playboy, ready to manipulate everybody, Antonio and Portia included, gets the money. He becomes a suitor to Portia, but then it turns out that Antonio is very likely to die if Shylock cuts his piece of flesh from Antonio's body. And so Portia is informed about these interesting plans of Shylock, and she comes to Venice disguised as a lawyer. She says she is a lawyer from Padua, and the people of Venice accept her as a judge, though they see her for the first time. And Portia first speaks to Shylock, explaining to him that he should show mercy, and she produces the famous monologue on mercy. The quality of mercy is not strained, but Shylock says, I'm tired of all this nonsense. Stop talking those Christian platitudes to me. I know that you disrespect me. I am ready to show equal disrespect. I want the pound of flesh, and I will receive it. And Portia again suggests that probably somebody else would pay this money. Shylock says, no, the money has not been paid on time. I need my pound of flesh. And then Shakespeare has to make an idiot out of Shylock. Portia says, by the way, there is a law in Venice which everybody among those present had forgotten about or had never heard about. And the idea is, according to Portia, according to the law, if somebody conspires against a citizen of Venice and says that he wants to shed his blood, how can you extract the pound of flesh and not shed a person's blood? This person should be banished, his property should be confiscated, and if he's not to be killed, at least he's to suffer complete devastation. And Shylock immediately is transformed into a kind of buffoon, saying, no, I want the money, I don't want a piece of flesh. Portia says it's too late. Now you will lose all your money. Part of it would come to Antonio, part of it would come to your own daughter, Shylock, who is ready to become Christian and to marry a Christian. And as a result, Shylock is trampled upon, and out of a self-respecting and, in a sense, attractive and noble person, he becomes a mountebank, a buffoon, a jester. So the transformation is rather rapid, but the feeling is that till the end of Act 3, at least, Shakespeare felt like showing this right of a person to be different and still to demand respect. And then Shakespeare had to reconsider the approach, because otherwise, instead of being anti-Semitic and understandable to the people around, the play would become Zionist. So Shakespeare had to reconsider quickly. But it's exactly for this reason that the comedy is much more serious than a common comedy written by Shakespeare or by his contemporaries. Now we have some pieces from The Merchant of Venice, which I would like you to look through. And the first two speeches of Shylock are very powerful rhetorically, and they show the desire of Shylock to free himself from those humiliating limitations the Christians are imposing on him. And then comes the platitudes of Portia, who says that you must be nice, you must be merciful, and after that, a completely merciless continuation would follow when Shylock is deprived of all his money on the basis of a law nobody knows about, and going in direct contradiction to what was agreed upon between him and Antonio. So first, Shylock addresses Antonio, who had asked him for money. Signor Antonio, many a time and oft, in the Rialto you have rated me about my monies and my usances. Yet have I borne it with a patient shrug, for sufferance is the badge of our tribe. You called me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spit upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is my own. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Go to then, you come to me, and you say, Shylock, we would have monies. You say so. You that did void your room upon my bed, and foot me as you spurn a stranger cur over your threshold. Monies is your suit. What should I say to you? Should I not say, has a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or shall I bend low and in a bondman's key, with bated breath and whispering humbleness say this? Fair sir, you spit on me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time you called me dog. And for these courtesies, I lend you thus much monies. And Antonio says, yes, give me the money. I will continue disrespecting you. And Shylock says, okay, you will get the money, but if I don't get my money at the right moment, if you don't return it, I will take the pound of your flesh. And then, again, a very powerful prosaic text where Shylock speaks about himself as a human being, deserving as much respect as anybody else. I am a Jew. Has not a Jew eyes? Has not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why? Revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction. And then Shylock, out of this human being with his acute sense of justice, a person ready to oppose the injustice done to him by the Christians, and he does it quite powerfully, then he turns into a buffoon, a mountebank, and it all happens in Act 4. First he speaks there very powerfully, but then he is reduced to a kind of weeping mountebank. The famous monologue of Portia, which shows, in fact, great hypocrisy because it is addressed to Shylock, who had never been shown mercy to by anybody else. And in contrast to the revealing and very powerful lines of Shylock, this is a very conventional text, but as it is written quite rhetorically powerfully by Shakespeare, and it is produced by Portia, it has become part of everybody's knowledge of Shakespeare's texts. The quality of mercy is not strained. It drops as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesses him that gives and him that takes. 'Tis mightiest in the mightiest. It becomes the throned monarch better than his crown. His scepter shows the force of temporal power, the attribute to awe and majesty, wherein doth sit the dread and fear of kings. But mercy is above this sceptred sway. It is enthroned in the hearts of kings. It is an attribute to God himself, An earthly power does then show likest gods when mercy seasons justice. Therefore, Jew, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the cause of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer does teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. So Portia says Shylock should be merciful, although he had been shown disrespect from start to finish in his communication with the Christian society. And then things which would follow, of which I have already spoken about above. So thank you very much for kind attention. We will be finished with Shakespeare next time, and during the remaining 3 or 4 lectures, we will quickly speak about the remaining ages, centuries of classic English poetry. Thank you very much for your kind attention.